The dust had settled years ago, but the silence within these walls remained thick and suffocating. Alara knew only the texture of rough wood against her cheek when she pressed herself into the corner. The musty scent of decay and neglect, the faint, perpetual tremor of fear that lived deep in her bones. The small, shuttered room was her world, a forgotten annex attached to a decaying cabin on the fringe of nowhere. Sunlight, when it dared to pierce the grime-streaked window cracks, was a cruel reminder of the vast, unknown space outside, a world that had deemed her unfit, undesirable, and worthy only of being hidden away. She measured her life in the predictable creaks of the old cabin settling, the changing pitch of the wind outside, the scuttling of mice in the walls. Food was left irregularly, a silent transaction in the dim light, usually stale bread or cold gruel, accompanied by not a word, not a glance. She had learned to be smaller than herself, to breathe shallowly, to exist as a ghost within her own skin. Her voice was a forgotten instrument, her own name a distant echo. Years had bled into a single, unending state of apprehension, a quiet waiting for. She didn't know what, perhaps the end of the waiting itself. One frigid afternoon, a sound broke the familiar monotony. Not the usual heavy footsteps of her occasional keeper, but a different tread, measured, steady, accompanied by the faint jingle of harness and the exhale of a horse. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She pressed herself tighter into the corner, willing herself invisible. Through a knothole in the wood, she watched. A man dismounted, tall and lean, his movements economical. He wore plains clothes, worn but clean, a duster coat against the bite in the air. He looked around the cabin with a practiced, assessing gaze, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. He didn't approach with haste or aggression, merely surveyed the dilapidated structure, the abandoned look of the place. He spent a long time simply standing there, a still point in the desolate landscape, the wind whipping around him. Panic warred with a strange, unfamiliar flicker of curiosity. He didn't look like the ones who sometimes came, didn't carry the same air of casual cruelty. His presence was quiet, observant. He tied his horse, then approached the cabin door, his steps unhurried. Alara held her breath, every muscle tensed. He tried the door, found it unlocked, and pushed it open slowly. The interior of the main cabin was exposed to her limited view, dusty, empty, a layer of disuse clinging to everything. He stepped inside, the sound muffled. Alara could hear the faint scrape of his boots, the quiet sigh as he moved through the space. He wasn't looking for her, not obviously. He seemed to be examining the structure itself, running a hand along a wall, testing a floorboard. He didn't call out, didn't announce his presence with harsh words or demands. He was simply there, a stranger in her long-standing silence. His quiet intrusion more unnerving than any shout might have been. The light began to fade, painting the edges of her view in long, gray shadows, and he remained inside, a shadow himself now, moving slowly in the dusk. The waiting had changed. The stranger stayed. He didn't find her, or perhaps he did and chose not to acknowledge her existence, a different kind of invisibility than the one she had cultivated. For 2 days she remained hidden, listening. He made a fire in the main cabin's hearth, the smell of wood smoke a scent she barely remembered, pulling at something deep and dormant within her. He was quiet, methodical. He seemed to be making the cabin habitable, not for a long stay, but a temporary shelter. He repaired a loose shutter, patched a hole in the roof where the wind howled loudest. He ate simple food, the aroma of beans and coffee drifting to her, a torment to her perpetually empty stomach. He never entered her small annex. He knew it was there. The separate door was obvious, but he left it untouched. He wasn't seeking her out, wasn't demanding she reveal herself. This passive acceptance of her hidden state was profoundly disorienting. Her keepers ignored her out of cruelty. This man ignored her out of, what? Respect? Indifference? He would step outside sometimes, tending to his horse, or simply looking out over the empty plains. She watched him through the knot-hole, studying the lines of his face when he took off his hat, the steady gaze of his eyes as he scanned the horizon. He wasn't young, etched by sun and wind, but there was a calmness about him, a self-possession that was utterly alien to her world of fear and uncertainty. His silence was not the oppressive silence of her confinement, but a quiet strength. On the third day, he did something different. He built a small fire outside, near the annex door. Then, he cooked something that smelled heavenly, meat, perhaps with herbs. When he was finished, he didn't take all the food inside. He left a tin plate near her door, placed a tin cup of water beside it. Then he went back into the main cabin without a word, without a glance towards her hiding place. Alara waited, her heart pounding. It was a test, surely, a trap. But the smell was unbearable. And he was gone. Slowly, tentatively, she crawled towards the door, reaching a trembling hand out to the plate. It was still warm, pulled by a hunger that went beyond her stomach, a hunger for a kindness she hadn't known existed. She ate. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. He continued this ritual. Each day, a plate of warm food, water, left silently near her door. No demands, no questions. He was simply providing sustenance, acknowledging her presence in the most basic, humane way, without forcing her hand. The ice around her heart began to melt, a slow, painful thaw. Trust, a word she barely understood, began to form not through grand gestures, but through the simple consistency of his quiet actions. She started to make small noises herself, unintentional at first, a rustle of fabric, a faint sigh. He never reacted. He allowed her to exist on her own terms in her own time. It was a profound, wordless conversation, built on food and firelight and the shared silence of the desolate place. A fragile bridge was being built across the chasm of her fear. The fragile peace was shattered with the suddenness of a gunshot. Alara flinched, pressing her hands over her ears, the instinct to hide overwhelming. But the sound wasn't aimed at the cabin. It was followed by shouts, rough voices, the sound of approaching horses. Not one or two, but several. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped her. These sounds were familiar in their menace, reminiscent of the infrequent, terrifying visits of her keepers, or perhaps those they sent on their behalf. She scrambled to her knothole, peering out. The stranger, Caleb, stood outside the main cabin door, rifle in hand, facing a group of riders who had pulled up short of the cabin. There were 3 of them, hard-faced men, armed and looking dangerous. Their leader, a burly man with a cruel mouth, spoke, his voice carrying clearly on the wind. "Heard someone was holed up here, stranger. Thought we'd come check on the property. Been keeping something for us? Have ya?" Caleb didn't move, his stance steady. "Just passing through." Cabin looked empty. Didn't see no sign of ownership. His voice was low, calm, a stark contrast to the menace of the riders. "Empty, is it?" The leader sneered. "Looks like you made yourself right at home. We know what's supposed to be here. A valuable piece of lost property. Or maybe you found her already." He gestured towards the annex with a tilt of his head, a chillingly casual movement that sent a jolt of raw terror through Alara. They knew. They were here for her. Caleb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Didn't see anyone else. Just the mice. The leader laughed. A harsh, unpleasant sound. "Don't play coy, stranger. We heard tell someone's been pokin' around this area. And she is worth money. Dead or alive, don't much matter, long as we prove we found her." Alara could feel the blood drain from her face. Proof. They would drag her out, parade her, destroy her. For money. Years of silent endurance had led to this moment. She was trapped. Caleb's gaze remained steady on the men, but his hand tightened on his rifle. "Don't know what you're talking about. This place is empty." The burly man signaled his companions. "Search it. And if he gets in the way." As the men started to dismount, a sudden, fierce wave of something other than fear surged through Alara. Anger. A cold, burning defiance that surprised her with its intensity. She had been hidden, starved, forgotten, But she would not be taken like a piece of property. Not dragged out in chains or thrown over a horse. She had no weapon, no strength, but she had her fear, and now this spark of fury. Without conscious thought, she acted. With trembling hands, she fumbled with the latch on her annex door. It was old, stiff, rarely used from her side. She scraped at it, the sound loud in her ears, praying it wasn't loud enough to carry outside. The riders were distracted by Caleb, who hadn't moved, still a silent, formidable obstacle. One of the riders dismounted and started towards the main cabin. Caleb spoke again, his voice still measured, but with an undertone of warning. "I said stay back." The rider ignored him, taking another step. Suddenly, Caleb raised his rifle slightly. Not aiming, not yet, but a clear signal. "Last warning." The leader bristled. "You think you can stop us, old man?" "I know I can stop one of you," Caleb said, his eyes narrowed. "Before the others drop me. And you'll have to live with that. It wasn't a threat, but a simple statement of fact, delivered with quiet certainty." The air crackled with tension. Alara pushed against the door, her muscles straining. It groaned, stuck fast. Suddenly, the lead rider drew his pistol. "We ain't got time for this. Move or die." The standoff tightened. Caleb didn't flinch. At that precise moment, with a final desperate heave, Alara's door scraped open a crack. Not enough to emerge, but enough to be seen. A sliver of dark space. The sound was small, but in the sudden silence that followed the leader's ultimatum, it was audible. One of the other riders, the one who wasn't dismounting, snapped his head towards the sound. His eyes widened. "There! In the annex!" The leader's head whipped around, his cruel eyes fixed on the dark crack. Alara froze, exposed. Caleb didn't hesitate. His rifle came up, fast and smooth. A single shot cracked through the air. The lead rider screamed, clutching his arm, his pistol clattering to the ground. The other two riders scrambled back towards their horses, startled by the sudden violence. "Get her! Don't let him have her!" the wounded leader roared, staggering. One of the mounted riders hesitated, looking from his bleeding leader to the unmoving, rifle-wielding Caleb. The other rider, younger and bolder, spurred his horse towards the annex. Caleb tracked him but didn't fire again immediately. He was waiting. Alara, driven by a primal fear and the strange, new resolve, yanked the door fully open, stepping out into the dim light, a frail, ghost-like figure. Her sudden appearance startled the approaching rider, who pulled up short. For a moment he just stared, eyes wide at the sight of her, ragged and gaunt, but standing. It was all the time Caleb needed. His rifle swung, fired. The rider tumbled from his horse. The third rider, seeing his comrades fall and the wild, unexpected sight of Alara standing exposed, didn't wait for orders. He spun his horse and galloped away, leaving the wounded leader staggering and cursing on the ground. Caleb kept his rifle trained on the two fallen men until he was sure they weren't getting up. Then, slowly, his eyes moved to Alara. She stood in the doorway of her long confinement, blinking in the fading light, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was visible. She was no longer hidden, and the world hadn't ended. The silence that followed the shots was different this time. It wasn't the suffocating silence of her hiding, but a stunned quiet, filled with the scent of gunpowder and the distant sound of a retreating horse. Caleb lowered his rifle slowly, his gaze fixed on Alara. She stood framed in the doorway, a figure emerging from shadow into the gray light of dusk. Her rags clung to her thin frame, her hair was a tangled mess, but her eyes, fixed on him, held a depth that hadn't been there before. He didn't approach her immediately. He gave her space, acknowledged the monumental step she had just taken. He walked over to the wounded leader, disarmed him, and bound his hands, his movements efficient and devoid of unnecessary force. He did the same for the fallen rider, confirming he was merely stunned, not dead. He then dragged them both to the main cabin and secured them inside. When he returned, Alara was still standing there. She hadn't moved, but the rigid tension had eased slightly from her shoulders. The cold air bit at her exposed skin, but she didn't retreat. She looked at the empty space where the riders had been, then back at Caleb, her expression unreadable. He finally spoke, his voice quiet, rough-edged. "They won't be back. Not for a while." She nodded slowly, a small movement but the first acknowledgement she had given him directly. "You came out," he stated, not a question. They wanted me," she whispered, her voice raspy and used. The sound was fragile, tentative, but it was hers. "I know," he said simply. He walked past her, into the small annex, his presence filling the cramped space she had occupied alone for so long. He looked around, his eyes taking in the bare walls, the dusty floor, the single worn blanket. He didn't show pity or revulsion, just a quiet understanding. He knelt, picked up the plate she had eaten from earlier. "It's a hard way to live," he said, looking at the plate. "It was the only way," she replied, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. He stood up, turning back to her. "It doesn't have to be anymore." Alara looked out at the darkening plains, then back at the dilapidated cabin, the annex that had been both her prison and her sanctuary. Years of conditioning screamed at her to retreat, to vanish, to become invisible again. But the taste of the food, the sight of this man standing against danger for her, the feel of the cold air on her face. Something had fundamentally shifted. The spark of anger had ignited a fragile flame of defiance. "Who are you?" she finally asked, the words feeling strange and heavy on her tongue. "Name's Caleb," he said. "Just a man traveling. Came across this place." "Why?" she asked, gesturing vaguely at the chaos, the wounded men inside. "Why help me?" He met her gaze, his eyes steady in the fading light. "Didn't seem right, leaving you like that. Nobody deserves to be property." It was the most profound thing anyone had said to her in years. Property. That's what she had been. Hidden away, guarded, valued only for some unknown reason they wouldn't tell her. "What happens now?" she asked, the future stretching before her, vast and terrifying and, for the first time, empty of predetermined confinement. Caleb looked out towards the horizon, where the last light was fading. "That's up to you. This place. It ain't fit. Not for you. There are other places. People who won't see you as property." She looked at him, a stranger who had offered her food, protection, and now a choice. The years of fear didn't vanish, but they no longer held her completely captive. The resilience that had allowed her to survive in the shadows now urged her forward, towards the unknown. I want to see," she said, her voice stronger now, though still hesitant. "The world outside." A faint, almost imperceptible nod from Caleb. "Then we'll go." She stepped fully out of the doorway, leaving the annex behind. The cold wind wrapped around her, a harsh embrace, but she didn't flinch. She looked small and frail, scarred by her ordeal, but she stood taller than she had in years. The hidden woman was gone, replaced by a woman weathered and marked, but finally, undeniably, present. Her life had been defined by being hidden away. Now, a kind stranger had not just taken a stand against her captors, but against the very idea of her concealment, offering her the chance to claim her own life in the light of day. It was a long, uncertain road ahead, marked by the scars of the past, but for the first time, the path was her own.